I was mid-code, headphones in, coffee half full, data logs flowing, when the new manager kicked my rolling chair like he was booting open a saloon door. "Food at your desk?" he said, gesturing at the sandwich I hadn't even unwrapped yet. "That's not how we do things now." I blinked up at him, still trying to register who the hell he even was. He hadn't introduced himself, just strutted into the server bay like he owned the building. "Break rooms for food. This is a workplace," he added, voice echoing through the racks like a wannabe drill sergeant. That was my first real introduction to Gavin Riker. Harvard tie, startup teeth, and the kind of ego that made him talk about himself in third person during team stand-ups. "Riker moves fast," he told the engineers once. "Riker expects results." I half expected him to start monologuing into a mirror. The man had no clue what we actually did, no understanding of how we built redundancy into the shipment pre-clearance engine, no concept of live rerouting protocols or delay prediction algorithms. He walked in with a clipboard and left trail marks like a wounded deer. Before we go deeper, real quick, if you're listening and haven't subscribed yet, it helps the team a ton if you hit that button and like the video. Seriously, 97% of people who hear these stories never subscribe, and it's what keeps us able to bring you more. All right, back to the mess. I'd been at Halpern & Co. for 5 years, buried behind racks 13 through 16, where the temperature held steady at 65 Blyvding, and the noise from the fans drowned out most small talk. That was by design. My role wasn't client-facing. I didn't wear heels or do networking lunches. I optimized the customs clearance routing for over 2,000 unique weekly cargo routes, covering 5 continents and 14 different port requirements. The backbone of the entire logistics operation? That was me. Every shipment that passed through our system, every customs form, every electronic manifest, every pre-declaration scan got touched by code I'd written, refined, or audited. I'd built the pre-clearance engine from scratch when our old vendor crashed during a South African rail strike. I was the reason the company didn't lose $8.3 million in spoilage that quarter, but I didn't do it for applause. I did it because it was elegant, because if I did my job right, no one noticed anything at all. Then came Gavin. He lasted maybe 3 hours before sending his first team-wide culture memo. I remember it because it used phrases like synergistic hygiene and visual tidiness equals data discipline. He called a standing meeting at 6:45 a.m. on a Wednesday, had us chant the word efficiency like we were in some cult. When no one replied, he added, "What you resist is what you need." I went back to my desk and double-checked the uptime logs. And then the real absurdity began. That Friday, I got flagged in an observational compliance notice for consumption of personal foodstuffs in a sensitive data processing environment. His words, my crime. A turkey sandwich on rye. Same sandwich I'd been eating, same spot, every Tuesday and Friday for years. He didn't know, or didn't care, that I'd been granted that exception by the previous CTO after I pulled an all-nighter debugging a shipment freeze that would have cost the company its biggest Pacific partner. To Gavin, though, none of that mattered. He didn't understand what I did. Worse, he didn't want to. His eyes never landed on terminal code. He just skimmed charts the BI team handed him and strutted into the CEO's office like he'd built the firm himself out of shoelaces and Red Bull. I asked him, calmly, if there had been a policy update, something official. He said, "There is now," and copied the entire team on a memo about discipline-centered leadership. At the bottom of the email, he included a link to a TED Talk titled, "Clean Desk, Clean Mind." I wish I was joking. By Monday, I was pulled into HR. The room smelled like stale printer toner and peppermint gum. Gavin sat on one side, legs crossed, arms folded like he'd just sentenced someone to exile. "This isn't just about food," he said. "It's about culture, fit, synergy." The HR woman nodded like a bobblehead. No mention of my work, no stats, no uptime logs, no mention that our entire customs pipeline, including the exception model for cross-port transfers and pre-declaration timestamps, ran through a system I personally maintained. Just a form. Termination. Cultural misalignment. I didn't raise my voice, didn't argue. I asked one thing. "Will it be handling module reassignment?" Gavin blinked. "It's all documented, right? We'll figure it out." I nodded, took my badge off, walked out. But what Gavin didn't know What no one in that room cared to ask was that the pre-clearance engine, the real one, not the test bed they saw in their dashboards, ran off a layered access credential tied to a silent license check, one tied to my active badge. The moment that badge deactivated, well, the system wasn't going to break. It was just going to wait. It wasn't even a messy sandwich, just turkey, spinach, provolone on rye, wrapped neatly, no mayo, no sauce, no crumbs. I ate the same thing every Tuesday and Friday. Ritual. Not that it mattered. Gavin stalked through the data floor like a bad scent, scanning desks like he was sniffing out contraband. When his eyes landed on my sandwich, you'd think I'd pulled out a raccoon. He stopped dead in his tracks, arms akimbo, lips tight. "Is that food?" he said, like he was speaking to a toddler holding a Sharpie near a white wall. I didn't flinch, just nodded. "Lunch." He looked around for witnesses. "That's unacceptable," he said louder, like he was laying down federal law. "Food belongs in the break room, not in front of code." He used that phrase again, in front of code, like I was offending some sacred digital altar. I took a breath. "Is there a written policy update?" He narrowed his eyes like I'd just challenged his manhood. "There is now," he said, and marched off like a man who'd won a courtroom battle. By the time I finished the last bite, Outlook dinged. Team-wide memo, subject line, new clean workspace directive, immediate compliance required, 8 bullet points about visual hygiene, team synergy, and shared professional expectations. The kicker? Point number 3. No consumption of food or beverage at workstations handling system-critical logic. Bolded, underlined, no legal reference, no policy code, just gospel from the Church of Gavin. Then came the part that made me set my mug down carefully. He'd added a line at the bottom. "Non-compliance will be formally noted. Culture starts with choices." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Culture starts with choices. He had no idea the choices I'd already made. I didn't respond. I didn't protest. I didn't call HR or forward it to legal like some folks might. I just closed the email and reopened the codebase. Line 1826. That's where the watchdog lived. A heartbeat listener that checked my employee badge every morning at 6:01 a.m. If the badge pinged active, the core stayed online. If it didn't, the engine didn't break. It simply went dark. Gavin didn't know about that line. Neither did the others. Not because it was hidden, but because no one had ever asked how the exceptions module handled pre-declaration timeouts in the Shanghai ports, or why our Montreal routing matrix needed dual override conditions. They just trusted the logs said pass. I rewrote those logs. I own those logs. Hell, the audit framework that Gavin used to track team compliance, that ran through a mirrored copy of my system. The irony wasn't lost on me. Still, I made no moves. Not yet. He escalated the next day. Wednesday morning, he called me out in the 9:15 team huddle. "Just a reminder that policies are non-negotiable," he said, staring directly at me while clutching a color-coded clipboard like it was a weapon. "We are building a culture here, a new one." I said nothing. Just tapped a note into my terminal and closed the meeting window. Behind me, I could hear a few coworkers shifting uncomfortably. No one wanted to take sides. I didn't blame them. Gavin wasn't just a micromanager. He was an insecure one, the worst kind. He thrived on creating invisible lines, then punishing whoever stepped over them. Thursday, he sent another email. "As part of our compliance reinforcement, we will begin random desk audits to ensure adherence. Keep it tidy, folks." The man was trying to manage a $700 million a quarter logistics framework like it was a 6th grade classroom. By then, I'd already backed up the license token files, made a clean export of my architectural diagrams, not because I planned to use them, but because I knew Gavin would try to claim ownership if anything failed. I even checked the clause in my original employment contract. Sure enough, buried in Addendum D, employee retains authorship recognition and transitional licensing rights in event of system-wide architecture authored solely by employee prior to formal cross-functional integration. That clause had been a pain to negotiate 5 years ago. Now, it was gold. Friday morning, he didn't say anything, just watched me from across the open floor like he was trying to manifest dominance with his jawline. I kept my eyes on the terminal, ran one last diagnostic, verified that my conditional triggers were aligned to my badge clearance, pinged the silent license validator, all green. Then I closed the lid, packed my bag, left the sandwich in the fridge. The real compliance test was coming. And Gavin? He was about to find out that enforcing culture without understanding systems is like polishing the floors while the foundation quietly crumbles beneath your feet. Friday morning started quiet. Too quiet. No Slack pings, no rescheduled stand-ups, not even Gavin's usual 7:01 a.m. email dump about daily intention metrics. I knew what that meant before the calendar invite even hit. 8:30 a.m. sharp. Conference room 3C. No subject, just meeting with HR. I didn't bother grabbing coffee. I walked in and found the setup already in place. HR rep seated, clipboard ready, hands folded like she was about to offer me condolences for a cat I never owned. Gavin sat to the side, arms crossed, eyes bouncing between his phone and the window. He didn't make eye contact. Didn't have to. His smug little half smile told me everything. "Thanks for coming in," the HR rep began, voice like she'd rehearsed this line a dozen times. "Gavin has raised some concerns." I nodded once. "About my performance?" She hesitated. Gavin didn't. "This is about more than performance," he said. "It's about cultural synergy, team alignment, setting an example." There it was. Not a word about my uptime metrics. Not a mention of the fact I'd maintained 99.998% routing accuracy across 5 regions. No acknowledgement that I'd reduced customs delays by 17% last quarter, or that I'd authored the audit module that legal used to satisfy trade compliance inspections. Cultural misalignment, the HR rep repeated like she was reciting scripture. We're going in a different direction. They slid the form across the table. 2 lines. No severance negotiation, no transition period, just reason for separation, terminated, cultural fit. I read it, then again. It was almost funny. A company whose global routing engine still depended on hard-coded JSON triggers buried in a custom rule set I'd built in 2019 was letting me go for not aligning with the vibes. I didn't argue, didn't explain. I just pulled the Halprin badge off my lanyard and laid it gently on the table. Then I asked, as casually as one might ask the weather, "Will it be handling module handoff?" Gavin waved it off. "We've got it documented. We'll loop in DevOps." Right. The moment I stepped out of that room, they believed they'd cleaned house. Removed the cog that didn't match the aesthetic. Gavin even had the nerve to clap me on the shoulder and say, "No hard feelings. We just need people who elevate the room." I nodded. Then walked straight past the elevators down to the second-floor server closet. It took 2 minutes. Legacy credential portal. Same login. Same backdoor I'd maintained since the old CTO asked me to keep a contingency path during the 2021 vendor swap. No one had updated access policies. No one had rotated keys. Gavin, in all his discipline and structure, hadn't thought to audit credential ownership before slapping a label on my head and walking me out. I opened the Watchdog script, verified the license token handshake. My badge had deactivated precisely at 8:37 a.m. The conditional logic I'd embedded in the core logistics engine did exactly what it was designed to do. It entered dormant mode, not failure, just silence. Every customs pre-clearance algorithm, every automated port manifest handshake, every exception rerouting logic, suspended in a polite stasis, waiting. The system wouldn't collapse. It would just stall. Traffic queues would grow, manifest approvals would delay. Nothing dramatic enough to scream sabotage, but disruptive enough that every executive in that building would feel it by Monday. I closed the terminal, cleared history, and walked out without looking back. What they didn't understand, what they never bothered to learn, was that my work was the culture. Not the fake synergy posters Gavin had ordered, not the beanbag breakroom furniture, not the 6 a.m. alignment huddles he loved so much. Systems don't care about feelings. They care about inputs, and the moment they terminated mine, they made a new one. Null. Saturday morning, I slept in. First time in months. No phone alarms, no overnight Slack alerts from Sydney or Frankfurt. Just the hum of my apartment's radiator and the smell of old coffee grounds in the sink. At 7:46 a.m., the first email came in. Not to me, of course. I wasn't part of Halperin's Slack channel anymore. But an old coworker, Nate from Network Ops, still had me on a personal distro. He BCC'd me on a chain titled Urgent, Logistics Delay, Routing Exceptions Escalating. I sipped my coffee. By 8:12 a.m., Shanghai's pre-clearance queue had ballooned to over 140 unresolved declarations. By 9:00, the São Paulo Customs API began returning timeout flags. Then came Rotterdam, Manila, Montreal. Systems didn't crash. They just hung, limboed in procedural stasis. The pre-clearance engine wasn't broken. It wasn't bugged. It hadn't been touched. It had simply stepped aside. The moment my badge deactivated, the license check expired. The watchdog script I'd embedded deep in the logistics rule set waited for confirmation from a verified employee ID. When it didn't get one, it sent a soft shutdown command across all outbound manifest modules. Like a conductor who steps off the podium mid-symphony, the orchestra doesn't stop. It drifts. The audit log showed every query firing, every request sent. But the routing logic refused to pass phase 2. No override, no elevation, no fallback. It waited for the one token no one realized they'd just burned. Me. By noon, exceptions were flooding in. Dozens of containers marked stalled, port origin flag unvalidated. The system wasn't just being fussy, it was doing exactly what it was designed to do: prevent unverified cargo from moving through international checkpoints without full manifest confirmation. Confirmation which, incidentally, required the routing token I had always personally authorized on badge check-in. They hadn't reassigned it. Hadn't even known it existed. Gavin, for all his talk about discipline systems and operational hygiene, hadn't once asked me for an architectural handoff. Not a walkthrough, not a transition. Just filed the paperwork and waved me out like I was a janitor with a sandwich addiction. And now, he'd fired the only person holding the global shipment map. The code wasn't sabotaged. There was no malice in the machine. It wasn't a bomb. It was a locked door, with the key tossed out by someone who never checked if there was a spare. My phone started buzzing by early afternoon. Unknown numbers. A few old colleagues. I didn't answer. Not yet. At 3:20 p.m., I got a text from Jenny in compliance. Hey, do you know if the pre-clearance engine had any dependency flags tied to badge ID? Just curious. I didn't respond, but I read it 3 times. Then another one came through, this time from Alan in legal. Out of curiosity, did you ever document any authorization thresholds for logistics exceptions? Trying to piece something together here. Still nothing from Gavin. Of course not. Men like him don't admit they missed a variable. They just raise their voice and blame the formula. By 5 p.m., internal reports started leaking. 2 shipments, one in transit to Dubai, one rerouted to Dublin, had stalled mid-processing. Both required revalidation due to mismatched origin tags, a quirk of the new port ID schema I'd implemented last year. It was working perfectly, just not for them. I pictured Gavin pacing the office in his sockless loafers, demanding to know who was accountable, trying to bluff his way through tech terms he didn't understand, asking someone to just reboot the cloud, slamming a whiteboard marker into a dry erase surface already stained with yesterday's buzzwords. Meanwhile, my apartment was warm, quiet. I made a grilled cheese. They thought they fired a cog. What they really did was toss the compass overboard and then act surprised when the ship started drifting. By Sunday morning, their panic had gone from whispered hallway stress to full-blown internal escalation. I could tell by the timestamps. 10-minute gaps between emails had become 2-minute barrages. Subject lines changed from system lag update to immediate action required, routing workflow halt to my favorite, legacy module authentication query, urgent. They'd started digging. Hard. Around 10:30 a.m., someone finally found the fallback documentation I'd left tucked away in the internal wiki, version 3.7 archived under Legacy Routing Framework Cold Boot Recovery. There were diagrams, dependencies, licensing flags, and one annotated list of restart preconditions. Line 47 was bolded, centered on its own page. System restart requires override token from registered module author. There was no bypass, No workaround, no catch-all admin key. That was intentional. The framework was sensitive, too critical to trust with a shared credential floating around the IT pool. During development, I made the override token tie directly to a named credential fingerprinted from my unique hardware key. And since Gavin never asked about system continuity, never debriefed me, never transferred the module authorship through legal channels, he just deleted the only verified author from the system without replacing me. That meant no one could restart the core. Not without me. Not without rebuilding the entire chain from scratch, and that, well, good luck. Gavin called at 11:12 a.m. The call rang twice. I declined. He called again at 11:14. I let it go to voicemail, but he didn't leave one. Men like Gavin don't leave voicemails. They assume their number alone should command attention. At 12:01 p.m., my inbox lit up with an email from Halperin's CEO. No greeting, just 5 words in bold. Urgent. Clarify asset dependencies from logistics core. It didn't say please. It didn't offer reinstatement. It didn't even try to pretend this was about collaboration. The man just wanted his system back. I closed the laptop. Out of habit, I opened a second window and checked the U.S. Trade Compliance Bureau's public portal. Sure enough, an incident filing had already been made that morning. It was logged under Manifest Discrepancy Report, Halperin & Co., a red flag icon next to the entry. Active review. I smiled, just barely. They'd tried to sweep it under the rug, pretend it was an internal glitch, a temporary hiccup. But when hundreds of shipping manifests go dark, when customs entries stall and automated clearance fails to complete, regulators notice. Fast. And if you can't verify shipment origin points tied to customs waivers under current routing protocol, that's not just a missed SLA, that's exposure. The very watchdog protocol they failed to understand was now highlighting every missing confirmation like a siren in an empty warehouse. Line by line, the system was logging failed validations, not deleting, not skipping, just logging, exposing. I imagined Gavin in the war room, surrounded by engineers, each one more nervous than the last. Someone reading aloud from the fallback documentation, voice cracking when they got to line 47. Someone else frantically searching internal HR logs for my exit paperwork. Another tech pulling up the license agreement to find out who had signing rights on the override token. Then legal leaning forward, slowly realizing they didn't just lose a system, they lost ownership. A colleague once told me, "You always hide your sharpest knife behind a drawer labeled compliance." I never corrected him. Let them think it's paperwork until they try to bypass the drawer and cut themselves. The CEO sent a follow-up email at 12:19. This time, he tried a different tone. Please confirm if you are the named author of the logistics core routing modules. If so, we would like to explore a reinstatement conversation. I didn't reply. Not yet. Because right as he was typing that, a regulatory inspector, sitting somewhere in a government office with bad coffee and a stack of port filings, had just flagged their main shipment pipeline for manifest inconsistency across declared versus processed origin points, which meant Halperin & Co. wasn't just down, they were now visible. By Monday morning, the ripple had become a tidal wave. 8 shipments spanning 4 continents were flagged as non-validated at their ports of entry. Manila, Rotterdam, Chicago, Johannesburg, each had cargo waiting on the same thing, a customs clearance code that no longer existed in the eyes of the system. Freight forwarders couldn't process the manifests. Customs agents wouldn't accept unsigned digital certifications. One particularly expensive container of temperature-sensitive pharmaceutical material sat on a tarmac in Abu Dhabi while the clock ran out on its cold chain guarantee. And those were just the shipments they knew about. Halperin's logistics dashboard, built to show real-time throughput status, looked like a game of Minesweeper on expert mode. Red flags, delayed timestamps, missing verification steps, retry buttons that might as well have been written in Latin. By 9:45 a.m., Gavin had pulled every engineer he could find into a corner conference room. I imagine he stood at the front like a man on trial, whiteboard marker in one hand, accusations in the other. He'd already gone through the denial stage. Now he was in scapegoating mode. The override logic should have been centralized, he reportedly said. Why didn't anyone raise this during the audit? Someone must have responded, probably one of the old hands who'd watched me build the original exception matrix from scratch. Because the next thing I heard through the grapevine was that Gavin started snapping about undocumented legacy infrastructure. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so predictable. Legal tried a different tactic. They blamed my documentation, or as they called it, the lack of clear modular ownership disclosure. But that argument didn't hold water for long, because I had documented it, clearly, repeatedly, in multiple emails, in every framework update, and most importantly, in the legal clause they'd all conveniently ignored, the one that granted me author-level control over the system, unless or until formal reassignment had been executed with written consent, which of course they never requested. I'd kept a copy of the signed clause. It was attached very neatly to the IP deactivation disclosure I submitted the moment HR terminated me. The U.S. Trade Compliance Bureau doesn't care about sandwiches. They don't care about Gavin's discipline initiatives or HR's vague culture fit excuse. What they do care about is whether or not your logistics system has a verifiable author, a valid operational license, and a clear change control protocol for employment-linked infrastructure. And in that regard, Halperin was naked. They had no override token, no continuity clause in action, no formal record of system handoff. From the Bureau's standpoint, the framework was no longer authorized for use. Any shipment processed through it post-termination was, in the simplest terms, out of compliance. That's when the first client called. A South Korean auto parts exporter. Their container, filled with custom transmission units bound for Detroit, was stuck in limbo. Missed the factory install window. That meant thousands in delay penalties, missed production, and now pending litigation for breach of SLA. By 11:30 a.m., 4 more clients had called. One of them, a seasoned import partner with a 22 annual contract, reportedly told the CEO, "If your back end is broken, I'll take my business to someone whose systems aren't tied to a single employee's lunch habits." Poetic. The CEO called an emergency meeting just before noon. Gavin showed up looking like he hadn't slept in 2 days. Legal counsel had joined the call. So had compliance. And, according to my friend still in the building, the lead trade operations officer sat stone-faced as the scope of the failure came into focus. Gavin tried to make it about documentation gaps. Legal tried to downplay the unofficial infrastructure reliance. Someone suggested bringing me back temporarily under a short-term consulting contract. The CEO interrupted with one line, "Why did we let her walk without a transfer protocol?" No one had an answer, because no one had thought it was necessary. They assumed legacy systems would behave like furniture, static, replaceable, indifferent. They didn't understand that what I'd built wasn't a system. It was a language, and now they were standing in a foreign country with no map, no translator, and every road sign pointing toward a regulatory audit. As for me, I spent the afternoon reading. Quiet. Sunlight through the window, a pot of tea steeping nearby. I didn't check email, didn't refresh the trade compliance dashboard. I'd already done my part. Submitted the required disclosures, listed the termination date, the revoked license key, the author dependency. Everything neat, documented. While Halperin scrambled to rewrite history in the face of scrutiny, I already had mine notarized and filed. The problem no longer lived inside their walls. It was on record now. The knock came at 7:03 a.m. sharp. Not the anxious kind of knock, not the panicked banging you'd expect from someone whose job is on fire. It was deliberate, calculated, the kind of knock that said he'd rehearsed this. I was in an old hoodie, half a cup into my morning coffee, watching the steam curl against the December glass. I opened the door slowly, expecting maybe a courier, maybe a neighbor complaining about the building's boiler again. Instead, there he was. Gavin Riker, MBA-branded desperation wrapped in a tailored wool coat he probably hadn't taken off since Sunday. Eyes bloodshot, jaw twitching, like he hadn't blinked since the last compliance call. His hair was messier than usual, and he clutched his phone like it was a rosary. "We need to talk," he said, voice low, like maybe the volume would make this feel more civil. No hard feelings, no apology, no acknowledgement of the mess, just no hard feelings, like that was supposed to make me forget being fired for the crime of eating lunch. I didn't invite him in. Instead, I stepped back just enough to grab the envelope sitting on the hallway console, a single-page memo on crisp Kessler and Grant letterhead. I handed it to him without a word. He took it like he thought it might burn him, opened it with shaking fingers, read the first paragraph, stopped cold when he hit the number. All reinstatement requests or module settlements must be directed to Kessler and Grant IP Counsel, it read. Fees begin at $2.1 million. He read it again, then a third time. His lips barely moved, like he was mouthing the figure in disbelief. We didn't even know you built it all, he said quietly. That sentence just hung there, not angry, not accusatory, just small, like he was realizing the foundation he thought he'd stood on was actually scaffolding someone else had built, years before he showed up, clipboard in hand, barking about culture and synergy. I let the silence sit. Let it fill the hallway like steam. He looked up like he was going to say something else. Maybe argue. Maybe beg. Maybe bluff his way through like he always did in meetings where he was in over his head. But then he saw my face. Saw I wasn't going to flinch, wasn't going to let him turn this into a negotiation, and the fight drained out of him. I nodded once, slowly. You terminated the author, I said. The system terminated itself. That's how it works. He looked back at the memo, the bold figure glaring up at him from the bottom of the page. Then he muttered it again, not to me, just to himself. We didn't even know. That was the whole problem, wasn't it? They never knew, because knowing would have required curiosity, humility, the ability to admit that not everything vital glows on a dashboard or presents at a quarterly review, that not everyone who keeps a company breathing sits in front of clients or runs team-building exercises. They never asked how the routing engine worked, never wondered why it had no vendor, never questioned how customs waivers got filed 4 minutes faster than their competitors, or why Halperin hadn't missed a manifest validation since I finished the failover logic in 2022. They just assumed it all came standard, like plumbing, until the pipes burst, and now here he was, soaked in it. He opened his mouth again, but I was already closing the door. Behind it, my coffee was still warm, and the silence on the other side? That was the sound of someone realizing the true cost of ignoring infrastructure when the infrastructure finally starts charging rent. Office 17B had never been that quiet. Not in all the years I'd worked there, not during audits, not even when a ransomware scare shut down half the East Coast node cluster back in 2020. But that morning, at 9:12 a.m. sharp, the silence inside that glass-walled war room carried weight. Dense, electric, the kind that presses on your lungs before anyone speaks. The CEO didn't knock, didn't sit, didn't even wait for the full compliance team to finish rolling out their risk dashboards. He came in with an audit folder clutched in one hand like a verdict and a printout of the Trade Compliance Bureau's red flag report in the other. His jaw was set. Not angry, surgical. He slapped the folder onto the table hard enough to make Gavin flinch. You fired who? Every head turned. Nobody breathed. You could hear the fans on the overhead projector slow. Gavin was seated near the end of the table, laptop open, Slack still pinging from somewhere off-screen. He looked smaller than usual, pale, sweat blooming beneath his collar, still trying to sit straight like posture could defend him. He started, voice catching. It wasn't performance-related. It was a cultural thing. There was an issue with break room policy. He said it softly, like saying it quieter would make it sound less absurd. The CEO blinked once, slowly, then looked to compliance. She held the clearance tokens for a $30 million logistics framework, he said, voice flat and razor clean. And you canned her over a sandwich? A few chairs creaked. No one else spoke. Legal pretended to check their notes. A junior engineer swallowed so loudly it echoed off the walls. Gavin didn't answer. He didn't need to, because the answer was already manifesting in real time. Ports stalled, declarations flagged, contracts breached. The system she built had stopped the moment her badge did, and no one in that room could explain why they hadn't known, hadn't anticipated, hadn't even thought to ask who the hell owned the keys to their most vital infrastructure. The CEO turned to the head of compliance. How bad is the exposure? She cleared her throat. As of this morning, 21 shipments affected. We're looking at estimated damages of $2.4 million, possible litigation from at least 3 partners. Regulatory inquiry is active. Trade compliance has flagged our routing framework as unverified operational architecture. A pause. And the audit logs? Still being decoded. They were written in a custom logging format, proprietary, unreadable without the original author's token. The CEO didn't say anything, just closed his eyes for a beat, then opened them and stared at Gavin like he was a rotting beam in an otherwise stable house. You didn't read her retention clause, did you? Gavin opened his mouth again, some mixture of excuse and damage control on the tip of his tongue, but the CEO held up one finger and shook his head. Slow. Stop. The room froze. Stop talking. For the next 3 minutes, no one said a word. The CEO flipped the audit folder open and started reading aloud, line by line. Architect retains system ownership unless superseded by signed, acknowledged technical transition under Section 4.3. Badge deactivation triggers license token nullification. Auth override unavailable absent certified module successor. Then he slid the folder to legal. Was that transition ever filed? The attorney shook his head. There's no record of it. So we terminated an asset-owning engineer without transition during peak cycle, and then tried to reboot her system with no authorization or plan. A few nods, mostly downward glances, no denials. Outside the glass walls, people moved quickly, quietly. No one wanted to look in. Gavin started to speak again, but this time the CEO didn't even acknowledge him. He just stood, adjusted his cufflinks, and said to no one in particular, "If we're lucky, we'll get her counsel on the phone by end of day. If not, tell finance to prep a number that starts with 2 and ends in million." He turned toward the door, paused, glanced back over his shoulder once. "Oh, and cancel whatever culture program that was, starting now." He left. The door clicked shut behind him. And in the silence that followed, Gavin finally sagged into his chair like someone had pulled the last thread holding him upright. The fallout wasn't coming. It had already arrived. On March 1st, the wire cleared at 9:42 a.m. The settlement line item read, "Vendor Payment, Logistics Systems Recovery IP Reactivation Agreement." Just above the signature block in careful legal language was the acknowledgement of authorship rights and licensing structure, retroactively formalized. Amount paid, $20,000 and $100,000. The funds landed in Modulus Trace Systems LLC. My LLC, I didn't celebrate, no champagne, no screenshots. No vague LinkedIn posts about growth or resilience. Just a brief, quiet email from my attorney confirming receipt and compliance with the agreement's non-disclosure clause. Then I closed the laptop, stepped out into the late winter air, and let the silence wrap around me like armor. The gossip came fast. Engineers speculating in Telegram threads, old coworkers sending me half-coded texts like, "Did you really make them pay 7 figures to reboot their own code?" I never responded. Not to them. Not to the recruiters who suddenly flooded my inbox. Not even to the compliance director from Halperin who tried to connect on LinkedIn with the most transparent message I'd ever seen. Let's stay in touch. We value people who build things that last. Funny, that value wasn't visible when I was still behind rack 16, but time has a way of clarifying value. 6 months later, someone forwarded me a screenshot from Halperin's website. Buried at the bottom of their global logistics capabilities landing page was a quiet line in gray text, powered by Modulus Trace. No fanfare, no announcement, no explanation to the public that the very same framework they once tried to delete had been reborn, only this time with terms. Terms they would never again overlook. Same code, new contract. Not a single line had changed since the day I walked out of their office with a sandwich in the fridge and a badge no one thought to respect. The difference was this time. The license was on my letterhead, not theirs. People asked me if I felt vindicated, but here's the thing about building systems that work. The results speak louder than revenge. I didn't need to go back, didn't need to get rehired or thanked or have Gavin apologize. He never did, by the way. Last I heard, he resigned to pursue opportunities in executive coaching. No press release, no blog post, just invoice T7. And in the end, that's all the proof I ever needed. Not because it was large, though it was, but because it was theirs. Their signature, their funds, their acknowledgement that what they tried to erase was something they couldn't replace. I built something that outlived their arrogance. And then I made them pay for it. That's not revenge. That's architecture. It was late September when I walked through those doors again. Not for work, not for drama, just curiosity, closure, maybe. A friend in security still owed me a favor, and when I texted her the night before, all she said was, "Come early, I'll look the other way." So at 7:41 a.m., I stepped back into Halperin & Co.'s. Same polished concrete floors, same flickering lobby light that had been blinking since 2018. But the energy, that had changed. The front desk had a new face, young, nervous, buried in paperwork and pretending not to see me as I walked past with a quiet nod to the badge reader that no longer knew my name. She didn't stop me. Most people don't when you walk like you still belong. I didn't head to the main conference wing, didn't bother peeking into legal or compliance. I already knew who was gone and who had been quietly reassigned. Gavin's nameplate had disappeared from the org chart in May. Word was, he'd left to pursue a new leadership philosophy initiative. Translation: escorted out under the cover of Q2 restructuring with just enough HR polish to make it seem mutual. His name never came up again. Now, a new manager sat in his old seat, young, attentive, not a trace of smugness. I caught a glimpse of him through the glass wall. He was asking a technician about something in the server logs. He listened, took notes, even nodded. A small thing, but different. I kept walking. The break room was brighter than I remembered. New tiles, sleek LED panels, fridge cleaned out and humming. Someone had stocked it with pre-cut fruit and imported yogurt. The snacks looked untouched, the kind no one actually eats but everyone takes pictures of for internal newsletters. The table had flowers. Fresh, but it was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, just absence. I smiled. Then I walked the hallway I used to own, past the racks, past the terminals, past the cold steel rows that had once hidden me while I tuned the machine no one else had bothered to learn. It still smelled like ozone and dust and legacy. My old seat was still there. Same chair, same monitor, same quiet hum from the rack fans behind it. And on the screen, a sticky note, curled slightly at the corner, faded from months of fluorescent light. If you touch this, you better know what you're doing. I stared at it for a moment. Not because I was surprised it was still there, but because no one had dared to remove it. Someone, maybe Nate, maybe someone newer, had left it as a warning, or a tribute. Hard to say. Maybe both. I didn't touch it. I didn't sit down. I just stood there for a minute, let the hum of the servers wrap around me again. Same rhythm I'd memorized over years. Same soft pulse of infrastructure that never once asked for credit, just attention. That seat, that system, it wasn't mine anymore. But it wasn't theirs either. Not really. Some systems defend themselves, others break down, collapse, scream, but a rare few, they just wait. Quiet. Patient. Watching to see who walks in next and whether they're foolish enough to believe that legacy code is just old code. I walked out without saying a word. The sticky note stayed right where it was.